Hello. Today I would like to talk to you about the U.S. political system. It's all about who gets what, when, and how. The citizens are the people. Popular sovereignty, voting rights, and civil liberties are what the U.S. is all about. Popular sovereignty is the principle that the authority of a state and its government is created and sustained by the consent of its people, who are also the source of all political power. Popular sovereignty, being a principle, does not imply any political implementation. Voting rights. The right to vote means that Americans have the right to be heard. Suffrage, political franchise, or simply franchise is the right to vote in public elections and referendums. In some languages, and occasionally in English, the right to vote is called active suffrage, as distinct from passive suffrage, which is the right to stand for election. Civil liberties. The state of being subject only to the laws established for the good of the community, especially regarding freedom of action and speech. A quote from the third President of the United States: educate and inform the whole mass of the people. They are the only sure reliance for the preservation of our liberty. Thomas Jefferson.
Our federal government is made up of three branches: the executive, legislative, and judicial. The executive branch is led by the president and vice president. They are the face of our nation, and the president is the commander-in-chief of the military and head law enforcement officer. The second branch of government is the legislative branch. This body is consistent of Congress, which is made up of our senators and representatives elected in each state. The legislative branch has the ability to pass laws, declare war, and is control of all of the country's finances. Lastly is the judicial branch. The judicial branch is what is thought of as the Supreme Court, but it also is consistent of the lower courts. The judicial branch has the duty of interpreting laws, determining the constitutionality of new legislation, and hearing individual cases brought to them from lower courts. Now you might be asking yourself, how do we elect people into these branches of government? So I'm going to start by explaining this process within the executive branch. First, to run for president, you have to be a natural-born citizen of the United States, 35 years old, and have been a resident of the United States for 14 years. Although this isn't the only position of executive authority, this is the most known, so I feel it is most appropriate to describe this process. Next, once we have an eligible candidate, or multiple, we go to a primary election. This is where citizens select an individual within their party to represent them. Eligible voters vote within their party. Next is the general election. The general election is the next step of the process, where every eligible voter can cast a vote for president, regardless of their party, and they do not have to stay within party lines. This is where the popular vote comes from. And lastly, the Electoral College is a very significant part of the election process. This is how the actual decision of who our president is made. A presidential candidate has to get 280 of the 539 electoral votes, which are a set group of electors with the sole purpose of electing a candidate into a specific office to win the election. Within the legislative branch, there are the two separate bodies of Congress, being the House and the Senate. With these two different bodies, there are also different eligibility requirements. Within the Senate, to be an eligible candidate, you have to be at least 30 years old, a U.S. citizen for at least 9 years, and live in the state that you are seeking to represent. In the Senate, the terms are 6 years. In the House, you have to be at least 25 years old, a U.S. citizen for at least 7 years, and live in the state that you are seeking to represent. Similarly to the executive branch, there are both primary and general elections for both the Senate and the House. Again, the general election are when you vote within your party to see which candidate you think is most qualified to represent you in the general election. And the general election gives all voters the opportunity to vote outside their party lines to see which candidate would best represent their region and their goals for the region. The last branch is the judicial branch. I want to talk about the Supreme Court selection process. The Supreme Court is consistent of 9 justices. There is 1 Chief Justice and 8 Associate Justices. There are 9 justices to prevent any ties from occurring while hearing a case, so decisions can be clearly made. Justices are put on the bench as presidents appoint them, and they are then consented to by the Senate. These appointments by the president are lifetime appointments. Once a Supreme Court justice sits on the bench, they are there for life or until they retire. Presidents can only appoint a Supreme Court justice if a spot becomes open in the case of retirement or death. With the creation of these 3 branches, the Founding Fathers were worried that one of these branches could become too powerful. So within the Constitution, they outlined a concept called separation of powers. Separation of powers refers to the constitutional law keeping the established 3 branches of government separate. This ensures that they all have individual responsibilities that do not interfere with the others. The true separation of powers is ensured through a process called checks and balances. Checks and balances are the concept of each branch of government so that one can never overpower the others, ensuring that the separation of powers are always maintained in a balance so that they can not only not overpower one another, but not overpower the common man. The checks and balances ensure that no branch can become too aggressive and defeat the liberties of one another or an everyday American. Some examples of how checks and balances and separation of powers work are the veto power, which is where a president can stop legislation that has been passed in both the House and Senate before he signs it into law, where he simply does not. The veto override, which is the counteract of the veto power, where Congress can override said veto with a 2/3 vote in both the House and the Senate. And lastly, judicial review, which is the ability by the judicial branch, specifically the Supreme Court, to declare legislation or executive acts unconstitutional and void. These are just a few examples of how branches of government check each other in order to stay within their bounds of power. These checks and balances are only efficient because all of the branches have separate roles. For example, the legislative branch is the only branch with the ability to pass laws. The judicial branch is the only branch with the ability to hear cases, and the executive branch is the only branch with the ability to lead the military. If these 3 branches didn't have separate roles, then checks and balances wouldn't be able to efficiently work, and separations of powers would be completely irrelevant and non-existent.
Linkage institutions. Parties provide a linkage between voters and elected officials, helping to tell voters what candidates stand for and providing a way for voters to hold their officials accountable for what they do in office, both individually and collectively. These institutions include elections, political parties, interest groups, and the media. Political parties. A political party is made up of individuals who organize to win elections, operate government, and influence public policy. The Democratic and Republican parties are currently the primary parties in Congress. Interest groups. Why people join interest groups. Safe roads, a safe public space, better schooling, minimized tuition fees, and affordable health care are just a few things that everyone can enjoy. In all types of political systems, interests and interest groups can be roughly put into 5 groups: economic interests, cause groups, public interests, private and public organization interests, and non-associational groups and interests. People join interest groups to increase their political efficacy. By joining like-minded individuals, they believe they can unite for the purpose of influencing government decisions. The media. A communication platform such as social media is persuasive and often works to change or influence opinions when it comes to political views because of the abundance of ideas, thoughts, and opinions circulating through the social media platform. Other examples of the media include print publications such as newspapers, the radio, the internet, and the television. A quote from our 16th president, Abraham Lincoln, also infamously remembered for successfully waging a political struggle and civil war that preserved the Union, abolished slavery, and created the possibility of civil and social freedom for African Americans. We the people are the rightful masters of both Congress and the courts, not to overthrow the Constitution, but to overthrow the men who pervert the Constitution. This concludes our talk on the U.S. political system. The government is legitimized through politics. Our culture accepts our government's regulations and processes and believes it is right. Thus, the government helps preserve social order. The social order allows us to coexist, and when the political process fails, we may have a civil war or international conflict. Violence affects everyone, displacing millions and killing thousands. We prefer to transform society through government rules. A quote from an infamous philosopher by the name of Plato. Plato is one of the most remembered philosophers in U.S. history. He is well known for his contributions to philosophy, mathematics, and politics. If you do not take an interest in the affairs of your government, then you are doomed to live under the rules of fools. This presentation has been brought to you by Teresa Fugit, Lilia Smithson, and Kaylee McPherson.